Hey everyone, this is Bathymetrics, and today I'm going to be demonstrating in detail why you should ignore all the YouTube videos you've ever seen that advise you to duck your sub to your kick by using some sort of EQ-based approach, something that uses a crossover or a dynamic EQ point or whatever. So specifically, I'm talking about Volume Shaper and Shaper Box has this great 3-band splitter up here, and you can duck each one of the regions. I don't have a high region, but I could set it up that way, right? You could duck each one of these regions with a separate ducking shape separately, and they talk about why that's a great thing. And I'm sure you've seen some YouTube videos in the past where someone shows you how they duck their sub to their kick by setting up a band splitter and ducking just the low end when the kick hits on their sub, right? Or you've seen somebody maybe in a video who uses something like Pro-MB, and they set up one region down here in their sub area, and they set this up to duck whenever the kick hits through side chaining or whatever. Or Fabfilter Pro-Q3 is newer, and everyone loves the new dynamic EQ feature of Pro-Q3, and so you may have seen a video where someone says, hey, don't duck your entire sub, use something like this and just, duck the low end with a low shelf every time the kick hits. And then there's also my favorite ducker that I do use all the time, and it has a crossover type filter built into it right here. And the way this is set up right now is it would be ducking only everything below 173 hertz when the kick hits, and it'll only duck the low end, and it won't touch anything above 173 hertz over here. Even this you should not use on your sub, and I'm going to explain why. So let me close these things down, and we'll get into the details. Instead, I guess I should set this up. Instead, what you should be doing for your duck is just a pure volume duck. Duck out only the volume. Do not mess with crossovers, not for your sub. The technique of splitting bands and adjusting or manipulating only one range of your entire spectrum, that's a perfectly good technique for lots of sounds, and it's a great technique for your entire mix. It is not a good technique for your sub. And that's the distinction I want to make before anyone starts sending me hate mail or comments saying I'm wrong. And, their favorite producer or teacher on YouTube has said, oh, you should do this. And you're wrong, Bathymetrics. No, I'm not wrong. I think if you pay really close attention to the people that do show you when and how to use frequency-specific adjustments like this, they're almost always talking about full mixes or entire buses or groups. They're not talking about your sub. And if you've got a YouTube video that's taught you to duck your sub this way, I'm sorry, they were wrong. They've never scoped what happens with their combined kick and sub, or they've never listened clearly for phase interference. And as I described in this video from just a few weeks ago, it can be really hard to train yourself to hear phase alignment issues between your kick and your sub. So I guess I should mention this. I put this out about 3 or 4 weeks ago. Some of you have probably seen it already. Some of you may not have seen it already, but this is essentially, the one I'm doing right now is essentially a follow-up to this video. It's a little more of a deeper look at something I said in this video, which is don't use any of these EQ-based techniques, right? And I didn't really, it was running long, as my videos often do, because I go very deep and I show lots of examples. So I probably didn't really explain in depth why you should avoid these EQ-based techniques for ducking your sub. And that's the main thing I'm going to focus on in this video. We're just really make sure you understand that. So without further ado, this is a real project. It's an early, what I call phase 2. I follow a workflow that breaks my songwriting approach into chunks. It's a workflow that was taught to me by my mentors, especially Il Gates. It's a good workflow. At some point in the future, I'll break down how this workflow works. In fact, I'm taking snapshots of this song as I go, and I plan to go back and sort of do some deconstructions of this project and all its different phases. But the main point is right now, this is a very early demo. It's just the bones of the song, the main sounds that are going to carry the song, and everything else I'm going to add after this point as I move into my phase 3 is going to be adding all the bells and whistles and sparkle and fairy dust and shine and polish around these core sounds. But this song as it is right now, if I play this demo end to end with just a very few sounds in here, it tells you what the song is going to be like. It tells you if the song is any good. So I'm not going to play the whole song for you, but I'm going to play the drop. I've got 4 bars of a drop with a sub pattern that's going on, slightly different patterns in each 4 bars. And kick and the only drums I have right now are kick and snare. I never add hi-hats and all that other stuff until much later in the process. In electronic dance music, especially the heavy bass genres, which is what I like to write, it's all about the kick, the snare, and the sub. If those things don't bang, if those things don't make you want to dance, if they don't have a bounce and a vertical feeling to them, you don't have a good song yet. So I always, focus in tight on the kick and the snare first. And then there's one other kind of main lead sound that's happening in the drop here. So let's let you hear this in its current state, and then we'll focus on just the kick and the sub and explain a little more about phase alignment and why you don't want to use the EQ-based stuff.
Felt that one.
I feel it.
Nice work, everyone.
Okay, and sorry for that little glitch on the bell pluck. It's the first time I've opened up this project today, and Bitwig on the first playthrough sometimes has to cache certain sounds so that it plays them smoothly on transitions like this. Anyway, so what I've got here is a subline that is very 808 based. It's kind of the bass sound I'm using here is kind of an 808 that's more subby than usual, or you can think of it as a sub that's more 808y than usual. This is what it sounds like by itself. And of course, you were hearing the ducking happening in there, so that's why it sounded a little glitchy in places. And then the kick is fairly meaty. Okay, not too meaty. I didn't want to have to fight the sub too much in this song. I wanted something shorter but still impactful. Okay, so let's turn off the snares so those aren't bothering us. Okay, I'm just muting those 2 snares real quick. So now we're just going to hear the kick and the sub together. And let's focus on this particular clip because this starts on the fundamental of the song. And if we look at the kicks and snare pattern against it, ignore all this background. All these lighter colored things are just the original drum pattern that I just muted out a bunch of stuff and then added my own. I was adapting a existing pattern and just finding the best flow and feel for the kick and snare. So this is the C1 lane are all the kicks, and then D1 and D sharp 1 are the snare and clap stacked together. So this is kind of a halftime feel. And you can see that here on the downbeat of the clip, right, the sub and the kick line up. And then there's a few places where the kick's disconnected from the sub. And then over here, it lines up again right here. So this points out one thing that I kind of should have mentioned in my last video. There are 3 different ways that people typically do sub patterns in electronic music. One is to tightly marry the sub to your kick, where the point of the sub is to outline the heaviness of the kick and to sort of extend the kick. And I mean, even in bass music genres like dubstep, which you'll hear this. It isn't just something that's done in trap. That's not something they only hear with 808s. I think, if I remember correctly, Skrillex has some new song called Fiji or Fiji Opener or something like that. And he's definitely got sections in his song where the kick and the sub are married together, they're hitting together, and so they have to be in phase, right? Or they're just going to sound bad. They're not going to sum up the way they should sum up. So that's one way to do subs, is to be emphasizing and outlining and reinforcing the heaviness and the impact of your kicks, and to extend them out into the sub that vibrates the air in your lungs. Okay, another way to do subs is the way that is very common in a lot of dubstep tunes, where you have these very busy mid-bass sounds that you're chopping and interleaving together in call and response fashion, and you've got 4 or 5 different mid-bass voices, and you want all of those mid-bass voices to be basses, right? So you've usually got a matching sub pattern that's in lockstep with every single MIDI note that was triggering your mid-bass noises, and the sub is creating the bottom end. And it's not, when you're doing dubstep, a lot of the mid-bass sounds you come up with, some are going to be much heavier down in the bottom end, and others are going to be lighter. And so to give them consistency, what a lot of us do is put a high-pass filter on almost all of our mid-bass sounds and basically take the sub out of them. And then we have a separate sub track that's like in perfect lockstep with the impact hits or transients of all those mid-bass sounds. And it's that separate subtrack that's providing the low end for all those sounds. And that way it's a nice, clean, consistent sine wave, usually a very clean sub, maybe a little pitch attack on the very first transient of each sub so that it has a little more impact that cuts through the mix. But the idea is the sub in that case is meant to provide the bottom end for all the mid-bass sounds. And then the third way of doing subs is common in trap. That's the most obvious example, but we also hear examples in other types of bass music genres, like this song. You can see that the sub itself is very disconnected from the kicks or any other sounds that are happening in the drop, and the sub is effectively playing its own pattern, its own counterpoint against everything else that's happening in the drop. And usually in disconnected sub approaches, you have really long sustained sub notes, and we're relying on gliding bounces to constantly keep the sub pitch moving around, which is great because, in a small club room where there's heavy room nodes and you move 2 feet and the sub is very different for every given note of a sub, making the sub frequency constantly shift around in pitch kind of makes the whole room a bigger sweet spot, if you will. It's a common technique, is to keep the sub moving around. So that's what this song is. And let's focus on just this one clip and where it's interacting with the kicks itself. Okay, so if you watched my last video, one question that might have occurred to you is, well, it's fine if you're aligning a kick that's at F and a sub that's at F, but what happens when the kick hits during a sub that's a different note? Like this one here is F sharp, and a kick is hitting right in the middle of that F sharp. Won't that be out of phase? Same thing's happening here. Well, no, that's a snare hit. So, but this one, definitely the kick is not in tune with this particular sub note. So won't that cause phase issues? And the answer is yes. Yes, it will cause phase issues, but this is one of the reasons we sidechain. It's not just so your kick can be heard through the mix. It's also to minimize phasing issues between your kick and your sub. And part of the story here is the side chaining and how much you're moving the sub out of the way of the kick, or how you're time aligning the sub so that any kind of phase interference is minimized. And you don't really hear the summed phase alignment issue between these two notes that are slightly different from each other, right? The kick is at F, the sub is at F1. So you can't make your sub and kick perfectly in phase for every single note across your entire song. That's an impossible task. The idea behind my last video was just to say, let's at least make the most impactful places where your kick and your sub usually hit together. Let's make sure those are aligned, right? So when a kick and a sub hit together on the downbeat, you want those to be locked tight. You want them to be in phase alignment. You want them to sound solid, right? You don't want the timbre of the kick to noticeably change because it's out of phase alignment with the sub. And so, these two kicks right here are happening with no accompanying sub. And so what you don't want is these two kicks sounding one way and then this kick suddenly sounding different or emptier or thinner or more hollow or flatter or brighter, because then it sounds like you have a very disconnected kick. You want all these kicks to sound the same as much as possible. So that's why we do phase alignment. That's why we do careful side chaining. Okay, so let's get into the scopes and explaining why these practices are bad. What I'm doing here is everything in my song projects typically rolls up this way to groups, and then these groups push down to the master. I have vocals separate from everything else in the song. This utility track, you can just ignore it. It's usually just empty, and I use it mostly for blind testing. I also use it for dummy clips, empty dummy clips across the top to remind me of my song structure. So most of the instrumentation, the subs, the synths, the drums, everything, they're all rolling up into this one group. So here's the group where I test and scope and look at the combined result of my drums and my subs. So I've muted the snares, and so all I'm hearing now by soloing these two groups is what happens when the sub and the kick hit together. And here's an oscilloscope that shows me visually what's happening. Okay, and I want you to notice that these kicks that are happening without any sub look identical to the kick when it happens in the middle of a sub, right? Kick, kick. You can see that the triangle, the ideal sort of triangle shape that helps you have punchy kicks in a mix. I talked about that in the last video. We've got the triangle kind of shape coming after the kick's transient. And we can see that even when it's merging with the sub, it's merging cleanly into the sub. This is the whole point of side chaining and phase alignment, is to get this little thing here nice and smooth, okay? And this is the ideal situation. This is what we want. Here's my sub. It's kind of an 808 sub, so it has its own little tiny transient, this sort of muted transient inside it, and that's what we're seeing right here. But then it quickly just turns into a big fat 808 sound, right? So one of the first things I did was I have a rack that I've built. Where are you? Kick, 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 sub, phase, scope. I have a rack that I've built that I can just drag in when I want to, and I'm putting it on this parent track where the drums and the subs are feeding up to. It's right here. And basically what I'm doing is, there's a little bit of a trick here. If you're not familiar with Bitwig, if you're one of the people watching this who use Ableton or FL Studio or some other DAW, the basic idea here is this is a container that has one or more chains in it, kind of like Ableton's audio groups or audio racks, right? I could have multiple chains in here, but this has only one chain. And unlike Ableton, or at least when I stopped using Ableton in version 10, their container has a mix knob on it. And if this is fully open, then whatever's in the channels here will be mixed with whatever's feeding into the container from the left, right? So it would be combined with the signal that's happening and starting over here and flowing in this direction. When the mix knob is all the way to the left, it's effectively muting the output of this. It's making this silent. It's just sitting here in the middle of the signal path, but it's not contributing its sound to what's going on. So this is just a quick and dirty way to not have to make a wet channel and a dry channel like you do in Ableton. Everyone who does stuff like this in Ableton, they have to make two channels, wet and dry. And they have to let the dry signal run through, and then they do something to maybe mute the wet channel so that it's not actually blending in with the sound that passes through. But Bitwig does it a different way, because here's your wet dry control right here. You don't have to make a separate wet dry kind of channel. So I'm effectively saying here, I'm doing some stuff in here, but keep it quiet. Don't actually affect the combined signal as it flows through. I'm using this only for scoping. So when I drill into this channel and we see what's inside here, that's indicated by this blue kind of border. I'm using, Bitwig has these things called receiver devices, and they're like virtual patch cables. I can grab a signal from anywhere in the project and inject it right here. I can tap a signal from anywhere and pull it in right here. And so what I'm doing is grabbing the output of my drums master right here, and I'm saying send that into an oscilloscope. And so this A channel of my oscilloscope is going to be the kick sound. And the B channel, the blue colored channel, is an external sidechain input. And I'm pulling in the sub sound. So I'm basically just comparing my kick against the sub, and I'm telling it to trigger on my kick. So what this looks like, from my last videos, this lets me do my phase alignment. So here's the kick and the sub hitting together. Okay, so because it's triggering on the A channel, which is my kick, it always just lines up nicely here. So here's the start of my kick transient, here's the kick shape, and then the blue line is the sub. And what we're seeing here is the effect of my ducker on the sub. I've got ducking happening right through here. And then I've been using some phase alignment to get where the sub starts actually adding energy. I'm making sure it's lined up more or less with what the kick is doing at that same point, so that I don't have a phase alignment problem. Okay. So over here on my sub group, nope, on the sub itself. Let's show you the phase alignment. Here's the sub. This is another kind of Bitwig container. Just ignore this. It lets me have different sounds that I can have automation jump back and forth between. I'm taking my incoming MIDI notes and shifting them down an octave, because this particular sub I'm using is pitched an octave higher than normal. The sub's coming out of Sublab, and then here's where I'm doing the phase alignment as described in detail in the last video. All right, if you really want to understand this, go watch this video. I'm using this time shift device to delay the sub signal by 5.9 milliseconds, and that's what's bringing this in phase. If I turn this off, and so now the sub is playing at its normal triggered impact timing, we can see, well, let's get rid of that first one. Right, there you go. See here, they're out of phase. The sub is starting to push upward and have some positive movement, but it's 180 degrees almost out of phase with what the kick is doing at that moment. And so if we look at the combined signal, by going to this other oscilloscope over here, let's blow this up again. Now we're just going to start looking at these two together. So kick and sub is out of phase. Look at this. That's what happens when your kick and your sub is out of phase. Right there. This little burble, there's a little bit of a gap. We don't have an even movement of these bassy, sine wavy notes from the sub blending into the bassy, subby, sine wavy notes of the sub itself. There's this gap here, and there's a thing that's slightly out of phase right here where this is happening. Right here. This is causing these blurbles, and this will look a little different every time. Just focus on what happens down here. See how it's a slightly different shape every time? Okay, not too bad there. But the point is it can get a little off depending on various things. So by doing just a tiny bit of time alignment after the ducking, we can make these more consistent when the kick and the sub hit together. So get this window open again. Okay, see how we have a more consistent transition from the kick into the sub? Now, ignore this because this is actually, I'm starting the clip like with 2 notes hitting right on the downbeat, and I'm starting up the DAW transport, and the timing of the ducker, the duck isn't really like in sync yet. If I were to start like just a few milliseconds before the actual beginning of the bar, we wouldn't have this little burble that happens usually on the very first time that the ducker is supposed to trigger. So just ignore this little burble on the first one. Okay, this is what happens once, when the transport's been running. Long before this happens, is we get this perfect transition from the kick to the sub. It's only that first hit that sometimes is a little messed up. Okay, so this is our ideal case, and I want you to notice that the kick sounds very consistent. It's got the same thump, whether it's hitting in isolation by itself or whether it's hitting with the sub. And that's just because of the way, I designed the ducking shape, the sub's getting out of the way and then smoothly crossfading with the kick to get this kind of look. And because we did a little bit of phase alignment, we don't have any weird gap right here either. We don't have anything changing. The kick looks identical, right? In both cases, identical. Okay, that's what you want. That's what you're going for. Now I'm going to show you what happens when you use these other types of ducking approaches, okay? So let's get rid of you. Let's move you up here. Let's focus on the place where we have all the duckers. And again, let me show you one more time. This is the ducking shape that I'm using. I know in the last video I said sometimes, actually a lot of times, this is the wrong kind of ducking shape, but it really always depends on your specific kick and your specific sub and how long the kick is. This is a fairly short but thumpy kick, so in this case, it just works out that this actually is the best kind of ducking shape to get this very smooth crossfade where the kick and the sub are blending together perfectly. Okay, so this is the ducking shape, and again, this is only volume. I'm not using ducks crossover techniques. So first, let's show you what happens when we use ducks crossover. I'm going to change this now to say, don't just duck the entire volume of the sub. Instead, I want you to duck only the frequencies below 105 hertz. Check this out. This is going to blow your mind. Look at that. This is what is hard to hear unless you train yourself to hear it, unless you teach yourself what phase issues sound like between your kick and your sub. And that was one of the big points of my last video, was trying to show you ways to hear it and see evidence of it. And an oscilloscope is the best way to see evidence, but you can teach yourself to hear it too. So look at what's happening here. First, I want to focus on the kick itself. See how we no longer have the same shape? There's phasing happening inside the kick here that's pulling this one peak downward. The kick itself is getting a little more grainy and jaggy, which means there's higher frequencies in this kick now. It's starting to include some high frequencies that weren't there before. It's losing its roundness and thickness and warmth in the body. This is a little jaggy right here, a teeny little jaggy. Let's go watch a few more kicks. Okay, here's the kick by itself, but even this kick is a little more jaggy than it used to look. Just a teeny bit. Eh, It's mostly the same because this is only affecting the sub. But certainly where the kick and the sub hit together, we can see that the shape is slightly different. See how these first two peaks are walking downward from each other, and then these two peaks are even, and then that walks downward again. And see how this one has two low peaks and this one up in the middle. Look at this one. These first two peaks where the transients are, we've lengthened the transient because of the combined signal between the kick and the sub. And now we have this transient that isn't as sharp and it's longer. This transient is also, well, never mind. It'll become more apparent in some of the other examples. And then this little peak is pulling down a little bit. This peak has also pushed louder and moved closer to these two peaks compared to here. And again, you see a smoother, rounder shape and gaps here. Here you see a lot more jaggies happening, especially around where the waveform turns around. And that's high frequency stuff. So that's just the kick. The kick alone is being affected every single time the sub hits, right? And then, of course, what's going on with the sub? Why is this happening? Okay, this does not look like the same subwave. Let's turn this off and look at it again. That's what it's supposed to look like. Turn this on, and we get this crap. Okay, it doesn't sound that different unless you've really trained yourself to hear what phase differences in a sub sound like. And here's what's going on. This crossover is set at 105 hertz, and I can tell from the shape of what it's doing to the sub that it's a 12 dB per octave slope on the crossover filter. Let's see if I can demonstrate that to you in a different plugin. It would be like, well, let's show you Shaper Box. I'm going to shut this down, actually, let me make sure the kick, yeah, turn that off. Okay. So remember this kind of weird, funky shape to the sub. Now let's look at Shaper Box. I'm turning off the XO ducker. So it's no longer ducking with XO. It's now ducking with this approach in Shaper Box, which is a similar kind of ducking shape. And this duck is happening only on the low band. There is no duck on the high band, okay? So I'm basically saying take everything below, where is this? 107 hertz, and use a 6 dB per octave crossover filter. Let me increase that to 12 dB per octave. And let's use this and watch what happens to the sub. See how we have that same exact shape on the sub? And of course, this is different, and I'll explain why later. But the main thing is it's the same exact weird shape happening to the sub. That's because the way most of these frequency splitting tricks work is they have a low pass filter and a high pass filter set at exactly the same band. And the steepness of the filter affects the phase of whatever signal is running through it. And phase problems, phase changes from a low pass shape or a shelving shape are much more obvious way down on the low end near the base and sub region. They really, really change the shape of the waveform. And so that's what you get here. If I change this to a more shallow filter that isn't doing as sharp of a cut between the two frequencies where the splitter is, we're going to see that this gets a little better, but it's still messed up. Okay, so here we see that the sub returns kind of, sort of, mostly to normal when it's just the sub by itself. And we're only getting the weird deformation or change to the sub when the duck is happening. This is the duck portion, and then it's finally rolling back out right around here, is about here in the oscilloscope. So I didn't really bother to closely define this. Let's see, can I do this real quick? Make this a little more like the other one. Let's say I take all these in a bit. Let's just move this whole shape in just a tinch. Let's see if we can get it more like the other one. The other thing is I didn't want to have to set up MIDI triggers to trigger this, so it's always just triggering at the start of every quarter note, every bar. It's triggering at the start of every bar. So I'm only going to see this particular ducker on the very first hit. Okay, so see we're crossfading in a little bit better now, but there's still like, you know, here's the volume the sub's at, but you can see that it's taking too long to get up here. So I could sit here and play with this shape and try and get it perfect and, you know, move it in here, but it's never going to be that good. All right. Fairly close, right? This is kind of acceptable, kind of, sort of. But the problem is, even with the 6 dB filter, it's still constantly affecting your sub. This is always there. The filter on your sub is always there. And it's always changing the shape. And again, I can demonstrate that by making the filter more extreme at 12 dB per octave. And now, even long after, you know, any duck is over, the whole sub is deformed. It's not the same subwave anymore. The only difference is their default 6 dB gentle thing makes it look more or less like the original sub. But if I were to turn off Shaper Box, pay attention to how this looks a little squared off right at the top there. It's a little smoother. You can see it's a little more rounded, right? So it's hard, you know, it's hard to get an oscilloscope to really show this level of detail, but again, it's always in effect. It never turns off. It's always affecting, oops, I have to actually turn it on. It's always affecting the sub, whether it's ducking or not. And that's the big problem to me with any of these band split approaches. Almost all of them always affect the sub. Now, there are a few that are much better about this. Shaper Box, poo. Don't use that feature in Shaper Box. If you're going to use Shaper Box to duck, only use the volume, okay? And again, we'll do some examples, some A-B comparing. In fact, let's do that now. Let's stop looking at this scope and let's just listen. I want you to listen really carefully to the quality of the kick over the first 2 or 3 kick hits here, or 2 or 4 kick hits, with and without the sub. So listen closely. Okay, hear how the kick always sounds the same. It's always meaty. It's always fat. It never changes in timbre. Okay. Now let's focus on just the first hit. All right. Now compare it to what Shaper Box was doing. Go back and forth. It's very subtle, but there's a phase difference there. Hear that thump to this kick? Now watch how it gets thinner sounding. Hear that twink, that kind of, what's we're looking for? There's like a boxy kind of envelope on top of the kick. It's a little more clicky, it's a little more high frequency, it's a little boxier. Here it is, nice and deep again. Round, deep, warm. Clicky. High-pitched, thin. Let's hear an even more extreme example. Here's our original well-done sidechain that's only volume. Fat kick, fat bottom. Hear how that's thin? Thin. Really thin. You can hear the difference with Fabfilter Pro-Q3. Thick. Thin, empty, hollow. Thick. Can you hear the difference? It's huge. I mean, my ears are shot. I'm an older producer. I have my ears wrecked from years on stage behind drums and bass, and it's just plain as day to me. So I hope it's plain as day to you. So let's look at Fabfilter Pro-Q3 and see why it's so messed up. And again, we're going to look at the oscilloscope to help understand this. All right, so this is the combined signal of Pro-Q3, I think. Make sure I've got it selected. Come here, you. Oh, wrong one. All right, turn on Pro-Q3. Duck is off. So yeah, Pro-Q3 is my only ducker happening right now. So one thing about Pro-Q3 that could be confusing is you're not even going to get the correct ducking behavior unless you click this little button right here. If it's gray, it's only going to trigger from whenever the frequency in this area pushes above the threshold. If this is on, it's listening to the side chain that's coming in, which is my kick from my XO bus is the side chain input. So now it's going to be a lot sharper and it's going to respond specifically to the kick. Okay, so there's a couple problems going on here. First things first is, see how long this release is? That's a huge release. There's no way to really adjust the release time of the dynamic EQs in Pro-Q3. They kind of are what they are. You can sort of adjust the release time by making sure that the signal's just barely going past your threshold. But the problem is I want to do a fairly deep duck. I want to try and get a full 12 dBs of duck out of this, which still isn't enough, but at least get 12 dBs. And sure enough, I can make that yellow line push all the way down to -12 here. But the problem is its normal speed of recovery, its release time, is just really, really long. It's too long for a duck. And so it makes my sub sound thinner and quieter right after the kick. And you definitely don't want that. You want that sub just hammering right after the kick. You want it just one sound. Okay, so Pro-Q3, even though you can adjust it to get, maybe as much as 12 dB of ducking, the release is just too long. And it's still causing the phase issues, but at least the phase issues are mostly going away by the time we're done, even at a 12 dB per octave slope. And of course, you can make that even better slightly by using a linear phase mode. See, now the deformation isn't quite as strong, so it's more like the original sub wave. But it's still, all the way up to here, you can see that it's affecting the shape of the sub, and the sub only returns to normal when the release is finally done. So at least they're not applying this curve unless the duck is in force. Once the duck is completely done, the waveform goes back to normal, so that's good. Yay, good for you guys. But it's still just the wrong approach for ducking, not for a sub. It's not speedy enough, it's not responsive enough. You can't adjust the release time. So Pro-Q3 is out. And let's also show you the other problem with Pro-Q3. Let's get, gosh, too many windows. Usually I have two monitors. Let's get this scope into play too, so you can see why another big problem with the frequency ducking. So again, we're still using Pro-Q3 for our duck. And this is the big problem right here. Because I'm only getting 12 dBs at most of actual gain reduction during the transient of the kick, it's not really reducing the sub energy during the kick. There's still all this sub energy, and you can see this peaks out of phase, this peaks out of phase, this peaks out of phase. And so it's changing the shape of the kick. It's interacting with the kick, and it's messing with the kick because we haven't made this a clean like zero line, and the sub only starts coming in as the kick is finally dying out, and we want the sub to take over. So this is the other problem with a lot of the compressor approaches to ducking. If you use Live 8 compressor, if you use any kind of compressor, Pro-C, I don't care what, it's really hard to get more than about 12 dBs of duck. That's about as much as you're ever going to get. And sure, it helps a little bit, but you're still going to leave all this crap sitting on top of your kick, and it's going to interface with your kick and create phase alignment issues. And so that's why we have all these jaggies right here. That's why we have this extra transient that is the wrong shape right here. It's too wide, it's too long. The transient should look like this. This is the kick when Pro-Q3 isn't messing with it. This is the kick when Pro-Q3 is messing with it. It's different. Transient's longer, right? So if I hit this with a clipper or a limiter, it's going to sound more distorted because here I'm only clipping maybe that one or maybe these two, but they're both only pulling down a tiny bit. And so you don't hear as much distortion as if you have a longer transient that you're just chopping off right here. And then that distortion becomes a little more apparent. And plus you can see the body waveform has these jaggies. So the whole pitch is going up, and it's all because of this interaction between the sub and the kick that you're not able to get rid of because it's not ducking far enough. So this is the other huge problem with any kind of compression-based ducker or dynamic ducker. Again, let's look at shaper box, and you can see the same problem here. This is the shaper box duck. Again, shaper box leaves all this crap in here. It can't push the signal down far enough. Again, just to show you what a good duck looks like, that's what you want a duck to look like. You don't want any sub interacting with the kick during the important part of the kick. Otherwise, you get a timbre change, and that's why we hear these as sounding flatter and thinner and more hollow and higher pitched and not as fat and meaty and warm. Okay, and then the last one is Pro-MB using a multi-band filter. So Pro-MB is pretty good. If you're going to try and duck this way, you're going to get some of the better results out of Pro-MB, but it's still going to have a similar problem. Let's make sure we're actually ducking with it. Turn that one on. And so now I had to really be aggressive as hell with the ratio and with the range. I said, take it all the way down 30 dB if you can and use the highest ratio possible. And it's still not really enough. Look at that. It leaves all this energy on the sub during the important part of the kick. It's just not getting out of the way. So again, we have that nasty, messy kind of summed behavior between the kick and the sub, even with Pro-MB. Come here. Oh, there you are. So again, we have this transient that's longer than it needs to be. We've got jaggies on the part that's supposed to be the cleanest, subbiest part of the kick. And here you can see what the kick should look like versus what it looks like when it's interacting with all this crap that Pro-MB is leaving here. Pro-MB can't even really duck more than about 6 or 9 dB. Watch how far this line goes down over here. It's only going down to here, which is only 9 dB. So Pro-DB can't even duck as far with like really aggressive ratio and range settings. Okay, so I think you're getting the point that these just aren't good approaches to ducking. And that was what I hope to show you in this video. I hope this has been useful. Again, if you don't have Bitwig and you have to use a third-party scope, go check my previous video where I point out a third-party scope that can get the job done. It's not the greatest. It's not nearly as nice as Bitwig's scope, but it's still useful. And thanks for hanging with me, and I'll see you next time.